Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This event was organized by the Center for European Studies and Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, and supported by Carleton University and by grants from the European Union and Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the European Union, Center for European Studies, and Carleton University.
So I'm going to talk about renewable energy politics under ambitious policies, and as Alex just said, I'm really interested in what I call policy feedback. So what happens after enactment, how the politics shift during implementation. And that's been a theme that many people have talked about here, but I think about that a lot from a political science perspective. So why on earth am I here talking about America? Well, as we've foreshadowed in some of the talks this conference, there are links between Canada and the U.S. on energy. There's air quality. Historically, there were issues with Ohio and acid rain problems. The way, of course, that coal, particulate matter, crosses boundaries. It doesn't care if there's a border there. We have interties with the U.S., sometimes more so than with the provinces. There's some kind of issue with the provinces cooperating with each other for some reason. They're more happy to cooperate with America sometimes. We have oil exports. Of course, these is major pipeline debates going on. And then we have these climate change collaborations. And this isn't just new. It's not just the new version of the Western Climate Initiative with Quebec, Ontario, and California. This dates back a long time to the New England Governors Association and the Atlantic provinces in Ontario and Quebec discussing climate change. So we have a really strong connection with the U.S. when it comes to energy. And of course, NAFTA also has a big part to do with that. There's rules as to that connection with the U.S. on energy. And so I think there's a potential for policy learning across this border, looking at what's being done in the U.S., looking at what's being done in Canada on renewables, and sharing lessons learned. So today I'm going to talk about what I view as the three most ambitious attempts to decarbonize the electricity system in North America, to shift away from coal in particular, but also to some extent, no, they're not shifting away from natural gas. That would just be a lie. Shift away from coal, and that's in California, Texas, and Ontario. The policies I'm going to talk about are RPSs, feed-in tariffs, and net metering. Now, what on earth are these things? You may have sat through this whole conference not knowing, so now you will know what these three things are. So an RPS is a quantity-based instrument. Somebody was calling it a quota. In the UK, sometimes it's called the NFFO. It has different terms, but it's that quantity or quota-based instrument, and it sets a goal for specific technologies by a specific year. Net metering, which we haven't talked a lot about, is a policy that's used actually in 42 states in the US, so it's extremely widespread. And what it allows is for citizens to feed their electricity back into the grid. And unlike a feed-in tariff, they're not paid, 80 cents a kilowatt hour or something like that. They're just paid the electricity price that they would be paying anyway, so it's the retail price. And that turns out to be good enough to make some significant money when you combine that with the federal investment tax credit in the United States. And finally, I'm going to talk about feed-in tariffs, which we have discussed a lot, but in my view, there's three main components to a feed-in tariff, and we can debate that. Standard purchase price, a purchase requirement to some extent, so that the grid has to take your electricity, and a long-term contract, so you have investor certainty. Okay, so what I want to think about is, with these ambitious subnational policies that we've seen in North America, what were the factors that enabled the implementation, their enactment in the first instance? And finally, what happened during implementation? How did it shift power between advocates and opponents? I think in Ontario, as we've heard, there's been a lot of opposition that's grown after implementation. And in California, it's been sort of the opposite effect. Advocates have really come to dominate the policy process. And many of you may not have heard this, but 3 weeks ago, there was a bill passed in California to actually set a 50% renewable energy target, an RPS. So that is incredibly ambitious. And California has just consistently ramped up their renewable portfolio standard, and that's in large part because of advocates being in control of the policy process over time. Okay, so this is a crazy table, but the point is, I just wanted to show you that California has used everything imaginable to try to do renewables. They've got feed-in tariffs going, net metering, renewable portfolio standards, and probably 10 other things. They're a really big place. They got a pretty big electricity system, but of course, when Jerry Brown was first governor, he was absolutely extraordinary in pushing down energy demand. So there's a massive conservation push. So when you think it's 38 million people and they only have a system of 67,000 megawatts, that's really impressive. So there's been a huge tradition of conservation in California. The key point is that it's about 16% in 2012. I have slightly less up-to-date statistics, my apologies. But that's a lot, is the point of the story. And the electricity price is also pretty darn high in California. I now pay that electricity price, and my gosh, is it ever high. That's all I gotta say. I was buying 100% wind energy when I lived in Massachusetts, and it was nothing compared to California, where I got 50% natural gas. But anyway. In Ontario, we have a pretty big system given the size of our population from the province, and we actually have a fairly low percentage of renewables compared to something like California, and Ian talked about that. So yeah, you can talk about capacity, but remember you have to think about the capacity factor, and it's actually pretty low despite that giant build-out, particularly of wind. And then you can think about Texas, where they passed their first feed-in tariff in 1999 when George Bush was the governor, and they've actually been really successful. Those Texans love to sing the praises of their renewable portfolio standard. The story I'm going to tell you a little bit today is that that has not translated at all into solar, even though you would think, it's Texas. They have good solar. And there's a reason for that. The natural gas companies do not want solar because, as we've been talking about, it pushes down that wholesale market price. And, of course, Texas has a restructured, deregulated market. And that market is run by something called EUCAnet. It's a group of people who are market participants who sit around and make the rules. So how's that for, market-based instrument? But anyway. So they made the rules that solar was not coming. Anyway. So how did these policies get passed? Well, often we see these policies pass in these multidimensional reform bills. In the US, they like to call these Christmas trees. The idea is that you have a tree, it's going through the legislature, and everybody hangs their ornament on it, okay? So I think when people are talking about, we have conflicting goals here and too many goals, you need to remember how that came to be. It came to be because there's all these people saying, all right, you want this to pass? Well, I'm a low-income advocate here, and so you got to give me something. And, okay, well, you want this to pass? I'm a coal generator, so you got to give me something. And everybody wants something. And some people want a renewable portfolio standard, and they get it. So that's exciting. So in California, that happened after the electricity crisis. Basically, the utilities, the 3 investor-owned utilities in California were in big trouble with the state. The state was super pissed off with them because they messed up the entire electricity system. You can think back to the insane crisis in California. So that opened up a historic policy window. They actually talked about nationalizing the grid, which is just radical in the United States to think about doing that. And that allowed them to pass a renewable portfolio standard. And later on, when the financial crisis came around, exactly like Ontario with their feed-in tariff, it allowed them to ramp it up. So they went for a larger target at that point of 33%. And now we're seeing them go for 50%. Similarly, in Texas, there was an electricity restructuring bill. We had a Republican governor, and the whole wave of restructuring was happening, and Texas wanted to get on board. Well, in order for the Democrats who controlled the balance of power at the time, I know you can't even believe that ever existed, but it's true, there were Democrats in Texas in the 1990s, the late 1990s, and they said, we're not going to do this unless you give us something. What are you going to give us? Well, you're going to give us air quality regulations. You're going to shut down some coal plants near Houston, where the air quality was really bad, much like Ontario and the politics around clean air in Ontario. And also, we're going to get this renewable portfolio standard. So, there was bargaining happening. And in Ontario, we had air quality. The Ontario Medical Association, if I have it correctly, was really important at pushing this, Clean Air Association. And so they said, look, there's people dying. The air is so bad. We need to do something about this. Later on, before the financial crisis, there was many projections in Ontario that we were going to have supply shortages. We didn't have enough power. We're going to have to build new stuff. Of course, after the financial crisis, we had too much power, but we kind of forget that earlier time. And then we had the financial crisis where people were worried about losing manufacturing jobs, historically as an auto industry in Ontario. And so they said, well, what are we going to do now? Well, I guess we could build inverters, we could build wind turbines, do that kind of thing. So my point here is that there are changing narratives over time, and advocates graft their ideas onto the existing dominant narrative of the day. They say, there's a bill passing, I'm going to get on board. So, if renewables doesn't always make sense, there's a reason for that. Like, public policy making is not a totally rational thing, it turns out. There's interests, for example. Okay, so the other thing I want to point out is that the system, whether or not it was restructured, also affected enactment and then later implementation. So in California, those utilities, as I mentioned, were totally discredited after the electricity crisis. What that meant was that there were very few opponents when that first renewable portfolio standard was passed, because nobody was going to listen to what Southern California Edison or PG&E thought when they were near bankruptcy and had made such a mess of the California electricity system. Similarly, in Texas, electricity restructuring, unfortunately, when I say similarly, I mean exact opposite. In Texas, you had natural gas, pain and all that. You had increased natural gas opponents. Basically, when you restructured the electricity system, there were these new merchant plants or independent power producers that came online, largely natural gas. They get paid the marginal price, the wholesale electricity price, and they were smart enough to look at what was happening in Switzerland and in European countries where solar was pushing down that price. And so when a law was passed in 2009, they had a solar RPS passed. They actually managed to ensure that that was not implemented. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. And in Ontario, it's a really interesting scenario because on the one hand, we had this restructured, hypothetically deregulated electricity system, but OPG was never privatized. What that meant was when the feed-in tariff and the RESOP were proposed, you had a crown corporation essentially as the main potential opponent, right? We're talking about utilities and incumbents being against renewables throughout this conference. Well, OPG is not going to stand up and say, to the energy minister, oh, we don't like what you're doing. And if you look at the testimony that was given around the Green Energy and Green Economy Act, you don't see opponents. I mean, this was like OSEA had a vision, they created a policy document, it had the numbers in it, 42 cents a kilowatt hour, and they managed to get it passed. Advocates were so dominant in the policymaking process, in part because of the way the electricity system was not restructured. OPG is not going to stand up and do it. And if you look at what happened in Nova Scotia with their feed-in tariff, they actually had a private utility, and they were quite opposed to the feed-in tariff. So I think you have to think a little bit about how restructuring affects advocates and opponents. Okay. This is just a little figure, not totally up to date. I only have 2011 here, which shows what was the electricity system like around the time of the first renewable portfolio standard or feed-in tariff, and what was it like in 2011. And what you can see in California, there was a pushing down of natural gas being used in the electricity system. And similarly in Texas, that gray bar at the top is wind coming in. So it's again pushing down natural gas and to a lesser extent coal. And in Ontario, you can see this is only 2011, but coal is almost entirely gone. But what's interesting is that nuclear was actually the fuel that overtook renewables in terms of replacing coal. So we talk a lot about shifting to renewables as dealing with this coal phase out, but renewables is only like 4% at this time, so it can't actually replace the coal that we were taking offline. Other sources were doing that. So we pass these policies and we think they're going to do something, and sometimes they don't, at least not to the extent that we would have liked. But the story in California is rather different. You can see this incredible ramp up of renewable energy capacity. They use geothermal, solar, and wind. And what's interesting is if you look at this data, it doesn't even include the behind-the-meter distributed generation. So at the same time that they were doing renewable portfolio standards, they also had a California solar initiative, a 1 million solar roof program that Arnold Schwarzenegger started. And that actually created a lot more additional renewables, which was not part of that 33% target that the utilities had to meet. So it's even more in many ways. You have to add to 33 with all that distributed solar. Great. 5 minutes. Okay, so what I argue a lot, this is sort of the only thing I like to talk about right now, it appears, is that once implemented, policies change. They are redistributing resources between advocates and opponents. And so we could find that new advocates come to be, which come to defend those policies against retrenchment attempts, or we could find that new or existing opponents get threatened and that they attack these policies. And we particularly see this in the United States from utilities. If you want to see a fascinating case of this death spiral, you should look at Arizona, where ASU, the incumbent utility, managed to put a fixed fee on solar users because they said that they were creating costs for the grid. And there was never any evidentiary hearing which said this was true or not. They just argued it and it happened. And there's a lot of evidence of corruption between the Corporation Commission, which is the Public Utility Commission, and this utility. Basically, they were meeting outside of the formal rules, and they were taking money for their campaigns because they're elected in Arizona, and basically doing what the utilities wanted them to do. So as these utilities get threatened, they start to do something about it. And I think that the major narratives that we've started to see contested, as Nick, for example, has talked about, is cost. This is particularly the case with feed-in tariffs. And I argue it's the case because a feed-in tariff is so much in the unit that we buy our electricity in, cents per kilowatt hour. It's really easy to say, well, I'm paying 9 cents and somehow solar is getting 42 cents, and those numbers are not the same. Versus, if you want to talk about oil and gas subsidies in Alberta, for example, or you want to talk about oil and gas subsidies across the United States, that goes through the tax code. It's extremely hard to make that apples and apples. It's apples and oranges. So I think feed-in tariffs get targeted as subsidies so much more quickly than oil and gas or coal subsidies because they're much more comparable. And then, of course, you can talk about technology, impacts on nearby communities being so prominent in the Ontario case, and then intermittency. So the thing is, I call this idea the fog of enactment. I say that at the time that we pass a policy, we often struggle to understand, well, what's going to happen next. And in Texas, what happened was they used the word target rather than goal in one part of their law, and opponents did this strategically so that when it went to be implemented, they said, oh, those aren't the same thing, so we don't actually have a solar renewable portfolio standard in this state. And they were successful at blocking it. And these companies were natural gas producers to some extent. California is now at this 50% target, and that's because utilities didn't really anticipate how big this renewable portfolio standard thing would get. And similarly in Ontario, they changed that Planning Act in order to make sure that those turbines would be built and everything would go forward, but they didn't really expect the backlash, particularly at the local scale against wind turbines. So in terms of policy feedback, I think in the US case, we see more interest group capture. Interest groups have a great extent ability to capture the public utility commissions, which is where these decisions are made in the United States. But in the Ontario case, what I've really seen is mass publics have been very important. And that's what we've heard today, that cost has mattered to consumers and that turbines in people's backyards has mattered. And what I call this is spatially distorted signaling. And what I mean by that is certain smaller populations, not in the cost perspective, but in the technology perspective, NIMBYism, are able to signal their preferences to the government to a much greater extent than other groups because they're spatially concentrated, because they live in a specific riding, a specific polling division. And so I did a study which looked at how far away from wind turbines we saw protest votes against the incumbent Liberal government. And basically what I find is that it goes for 3 kilometers away from wind turbines, and then it goes to 0, which basically means that probably the majority of people, and at the same time as this was happening, there were public opinion polls done in Ontario which showed like 90% of Ontarians wanted more wind energy. Okay, so that to me suggests this was a very popular policy. Versus these opponents who were living within 3 kilometers said to the government, we don't want this policy. And then op-eds were written that said, they lost the majority government by 1 seat because of this policy. And I don't actually think that's empirically the case. They only lost 6,000 votes. But what happened next, guys? Well, they froze the feed-in tariff for anything, less than half a megawatt, essentially. What does that mean? No wind turbines, right? So the government was responding to a minority group who didn't like turbines. And, I don't want to be controversial. There's reasons to not like turbines, but I think that this was not reflecting the majority will. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is this spillover thing, and I'm going to get beeped, but I'm going to talk about it. I think there are spillovers. We were a little depressed yesterday. Oh, this is all terrible. But there are spillovers. When California acts, some good things happen. First of all, cost reductions is a really key spillover. Germany doing all that feed-in tariff stuff brought down the price for everybody else, and that's great. So we get that kind of spillover. We also get solar companies crossing state lines in the United States, arguing against these fixed fees on net metering. Solar City and Sunrun are these solar leasing companies, and they don't just stay put in California. They try to open up new markets for themselves and also keep existing markets. And I think with Tesla and the electric vehicles, we're going to start to see a really similar dynamic too. So it's exciting. California's doing cool innovation. We're not going to all die in 20 years from climate change. I hope. Okay, and also maybe we can concentrate all those opponents in Alberta and Texas, and then the rest of us can get on with this decarbonization problem, right? Okay, so this is a hard problem politically. That's what I argue. And we got to think of who's benefiting and who's losing and, make it work out so that we can decarbonize the electricity system. And finally, I have to end with Thomas Edison. I love this quote. basically, this is from 1916, and Thomas Edison is talking about how we need natural sources like the wind and the sun to make our energy. You know, this man was already forecasting that that was the way we could go. What happened instead was Insull took over the electricity business, and he just focused on cost reductions and existing technology. And since that time, utilities have been not at all innovative. They haven't at all been thinking about creating new technologies or reducing costs. And so I'm hopeful that now we're finally in an era where new companies that are not electric utilities like SolarCity, Sunrun, et cetera, are actually going to come into the market and disrupt these utilities that have just been doing nothing in terms of innovation for decades. So think of Thomas Edison and smile. Okay, thank you. Sorry I took 2 extra minutes.